It was just another quiet morning at Harold's auto repair shop. The sun was barely peeking through the tall oaks lining the street, casting a soft glow over the small town of Rosewood. Most people had already gone off to work, leaving behind the peaceful hum of morning traffic. Inside the shop, the steady click-clack of tools was the only sound. The old man had been doing this for decades now, fixing cars, helping people, and he didn't mind the solitude. Harold Parker, a sprightly 73-year-old mechanic with thick glasses and hands calloused from years of labor, was in the middle of fixing a worn-out radiator when he heard a soft knock on the door. He raised an eyebrow. It wasn't the usual time for customers to drop by. Most of his business came from regulars, locals who knew he was the only one who could fix their car without overcharging or making them feel rushed. But this knock, it felt different. "Who's there?" Harold called out, wiping his hands. "On a rag." The door creaked open, and to his surprise, there stood a man who looked like he stepped out of a movie screen. Keanu Reeves. Harold blinked a few times, not sure if he was seeing things. The actor, famous for his roles in The Matrix and John Wick, stood at the threshold of the small shop, his calm, laid-back demeanor only adding to the surreal feeling of the moment. "Hi there," Keanu said, giving Harold a small, friendly smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I need some help with my car. It's been making this strange noise." Harold's mind was racing. He had watched Keanu on screen countless times, admiring not just his acting, but the humility and kindness that the actor seemed to radiate off-screen as well. But now, standing before him, Harold couldn't believe his eyes. Keanu Reeves, here, in his little shop asking for a favor. The thought almost made him laugh. Sure, come on in," Harold stammered, finally snapping out of his daze. He motioned toward the work area, trying to keep it together. Keanu stepped inside, his eyes scanning the walls lined with old toolboxes, car parts and posters of vintage cars. The smell of oil and metal filled the air, and the steady hum of a fan in the corner provided a backdrop to the moment. "I wasn't sure if you'd be able to help, but I've been driving this old thing for a while now," Keanu said, pointing to a sleek black car parked outside the door. "She's been giving me trouble." Harold nodded, still trying to wrap his mind around the fact that this was actually happening. "I'll take a look," he said, walking over to the car with Keanu following close behind. The car was beautiful, a classic model, its glossy finish showing signs of age. But there was something about it, something that felt timeless. Just like the actor standing next to it. "So what seems to be the problem?" Harold asked, popping open the hood. Keanu ran a hand through his hair, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I'm not sure. It's making a weird noise when I shift gears. I've had a couple of people look at it, but no one can figure it out." Harold knelt down, inspecting the engine with a practiced eye. The car was old, but not too far gone. He could tell it had been well taken care of. No shortcuts, no cheap fixes. But it had some quirks. Every car did. "I'll need to take it apart a bit, see if I can find the root of the problem," Harold said, grabbing his tools. "But don't worry, I'll get it running smooth again." Keanu nodded, though Harold could tell he was anxious. The actor's usual calmness seemed to be replaced with a quiet frustration. As Harold worked, Keanu stood nearby, looking out. The window, his mind clearly elsewhere. "So you're in town for long?" Harold asked casually, trying to break the silence. "Just a few days," Keanu replied, his voice soft. "Work stuff. Sometimes I need a break from the city. You know how it is." Harold nodded. He didn't know exactly what it was like to be famous, but he understood the need for solitude. Sometimes life could get overwhelming. Everyone needed a place to recharge, away from the noise. "Yeah, I get that," Harold said, tightening a bolt. "There's something about small towns. Like this, quiet, peaceful, no one's in a rush." Keanu smiled faintly. "Exactly. It's nice, feels like a different world." As the minutes passed, Harold worked steadily, enjoying the rhythm of the task. But his mind kept drifting back to the unexpected guest. Keanu Reeves was here, right in front of him. And for a moment, Harold allowed himself to forget the fame and fortune, the red carpets and flashing cameras. What mattered now was that he was fixing this man's car, just like he'd fix anyone else's. No celebrity status, just two people, each with their own story. Harold paused, wiping his brow, and glanced over at Keanu, who was still lost in thought. "You know," Harold said, his voice thoughtful, "there's a lot to be said about the simple things in life. A good day's work, a job well done, a quiet moment. Sometimes that's all we really need." Keanu looked up at him, and for the first time his expression seemed less guarded. "You're right," he said, his voice sincere. "I've been chasing a lot of things and maybe I've missed that." Harold gave him a knowing smile, then returned to work. They didn't need to say more. The words were understood. Both of them caught in the quiet comfort of a shared moment. As the hours passed, the car was almost good as new, and Keanu seemed more at ease, his earlier tension easing into something more relaxed. Finally, Harold wiped his hands on his rag and stood up. "All done," he said. "She's running as good as new." Keanu walked over and slid into the driver's seat, starting the engine. The purr of the motor was smooth, steady, exactly what Harold had hoped for. Keanu smiled, clearly relieved. "You really know your stuff," Keanu said, his gratitude evident. Harold chuckled. "It's just a job, son. Just a job." But as Keanu reached into his pocket to pull out a few bills, Harold waved him off. "No need for that. Consider it a favor. You're a good man." Keanu paused, surprised. He had expected to pay, of course. But the mechanic's offer of kindness was unexpected, and somehow more valuable. "You sure?" Keanu asked. Harold smiled again. "Positive. Just take care of yourself, all right?" Keanu looked at him for a moment, his eyes softening before nodding. "Thanks, really." With a final wave, Keanu climbed into his car and drove off, leaving Harold standing outside his shop, still in disbelief that he'd just fixed Keanu Reeves's car. But something about that interaction, something about the quiet understanding they'd shared, stayed with Harold. It wasn't just about the car. It was about connection, the kind that went beyond the surface, beyond fame and wealth, and deep down Harold knew that this unexpected visit was just the beginning of something bigger. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward even when things get tough? Harold spent the next few days back in his rhythm, working on cars, having short conversations with the regulars, and enjoying the peaceful hum of his workshop. But there was something different about this week, something that lingered in the air like a tune that wouldn't quite leave his mind. Keanu Reeves. The thought of the actor's visit kept popping up in Harold's head. Not because of the fame or the glitz of Hollywood, but because of the conversation they'd had. That unexpected moment of connection, when Keanu opened up to him, left Harold wondering about the man behind the image. It wasn't like Keanu had poured out his heart, but the brief exchange had revealed something deeper. In between the casual words about work, fame, and his need for peace, Keanu had shown Harold a side of him that was completely different from the characters he portrayed on screen. He was just a man who struggled just like everyone else, and yet Harold couldn't help but wonder how much more complicated Keanu's life must be, especially when he was so used to being constantly in the public eye. As the days passed, Harold worked on a few more cars, nothing too out of the ordinary, the usual fix-ups. But every time a new customer came through the door, Harold's mind would inevitably drift back to the unexpected visitor. He began to wonder, what if Keanu came back? What if he needed help with something else? Or maybe, just maybe, he wanted to continue their conversation. His thoughts were interrupted one late morning when a familiar, sleek black car pulled into the driveway of his shop, the same one Keanu had driven just a few days ago. Keanu stepped out of the car, his face a little more drawn than last time. He looked a bit tired, as if the weight of the world was bearing down on him. As always, he carried himself with that calm, collected demeanor, but Harold could tell that something had shifted. This wasn't just a simple return visit. It was different. "Hey there," Keanu said, his voice sounding a little more strained than usual. "I hate to bother you again, but there's something else. It's not the car this time, it's me." Harold raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Instead, he gestured for Keanu to follow him into the shop. "I'm listening," Harold said, his voice steady but warm. Keanu walked in slowly, almost as if he were trying to find the right words. He glanced around the shop, looking at the grease-splattered walls and the worn workbenches. An odd comfort, perhaps. There was something grounding about it, something that felt real. "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about," Keanu began, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. "About life, about the simple things." Harold nodded, silently encouraging him to continue. "I've been dealing with a lot more than I let on," Keanu continued, rubbing his forehead. "Fame is strange. You get everything you think you want, but there's still something missing. You start questioning whether anyone sees the real you, whether they care about the real you." Harold listened, leaning against the counter, not saying a word. He had no need to rush Keanu or offer advice. Sometimes all a person needed was someone to listen. "I know this sounds crazy," Keanu added, looking up with a slightly self-deprecating smile, "but I think talking to you, it helped. In a way I didn't expect." Harold's heart softened. He wasn't the kind of man who made a habit of giving out advice, but somehow Keanu had found something in his words that helped him process his own struggles. "You don't have to explain it," Harold said, his voice calm. "We all have our battles. You're no different. But the important thing is finding something real, something that can ground you." Keanu smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, that's what I've been trying to figure out." Harold let the silence hang for a moment before he added, "It's hard, but that's life. It's about finding peace within yourself. Fame, success, all of that, it doesn't fill the hole. It's what's inside you that counts." Keanu exhaled as if Harold's words had hit home. He stood for a moment, his eyes distant, lost in thought. Then he turned back toward Harold, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You know," Keanu said, "I've been all over the world, met countless people, but I've never met anyone quite like you. You get it, don't you?" Harold chuckled softly. "I'm just an old man fixing cars, son. I'm not sure I get anything, but I know enough to know that real connections aren't about fame or money. They're about understanding and kindness." Keanu nodded, his gaze softening. "That's exactly it, and I think I've been looking for that for so long, trying to figure out who I really am beyond everything else." "Well," Harold said, straightening up and picking up his wrench, "you've already figured it out more than you realize. You're human, just like the rest of us. We all have our own struggles. The trick is to not let them define you." Keanu looked at Harold, his expression filled with something between gratitude and understanding. There was a quiet respect between them now, a bond that was more than just a celebrity visiting a mechanic's shop. It was two people from different walks of life, sharing something real. "I don't know how to thank you," Keanu said, his voice low. "This is more than just fixing a car, you know." Harold smiled and shrugged. "You don't have to thank me, son. Sometimes just talking is enough." As Keanu turned to leave, Harold called after him. "You ever need a place to clear your head, you come on back. I'll always be here." Keanu stopped, his hand on the door handle. He turned and gave Harold one last look, a look of silent gratitude that said more than words ever could. "You've got yourself a deal," Keanu said quietly before walking out the door and getting back into his car. Harold stood there for a moment, watching him drive away, feeling a strange sense of fulfillment. He'd helped someone in a way he never expected, and perhaps, just maybe, had helped Keanu find a little peace. The days after Keanu's second visit passed in a blur for Harold. Business at the shop was steady, people in and out, a mix of old cars needing repairs and new ones wanting maintenance. But as usual, Harold wasn't concerned with the volume of work. It was the people who walked through the door that caught his attention, and Keanu had stuck with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, more to the man who had come to him for something beyond a simple fix for his car. Harold hadn't heard from Keanu since that day, but he wasn't expecting to. People with that much on their plate, people like Keanu, didn't just stay in touch with small-town mechanics. Still, Harold couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Keanu's life than what he let on, and part of him couldn't help but feel protective. The world was a tough place, especially when you were constantly in the spotlight, and from what Harold had seen in their conversations, Keanu needed more than just an ear. He needed a friend. It was a week later, during a late afternoon, when Harold was locking up the shop for the night, that the familiar black car pulled up again. He hadn't expected it, But as the car came to a stop, he saw Keanu climb out, his posture a little more rigid this time, a faint tension in his stride. "Evening, Harold," Keanu said, his voice carrying a weight that Harold hadn't heard before. Harold waved him in, his curiosity piqued. "Evening, son. What brings you back here tonight?" Keanu didn't waste time with pleasantries. He was clearly troubled. "I need to talk," Keanu said quietly, the words heavy with something Harold couldn't quite place. Harold motioned to the worn-out couch in the corner of the shop. "Take a seat. You look like you've got a lot on your mind." Keanu hesitated. For a moment, his fingers running through his hair before he took a seat, sinking into the old couch. His eyes were clouded, a far cry from the relaxed demeanor he had shown on his first visit. Harold noticed the subtle shifts, the way Keanu's shoulders seemed tenser, the way his hands fidgeted in his lap. It wasn't just the car that brought him here this time. This was something deeper. "I don't know where else to go," Keanu finally spoke, his voice a little quieter, as if unsure whether or not he should open up. "I've been struggling, and I'm not sure how to deal with it." Harold nodded, his gaze steady but kind. "You're in a safe place, Keanu. You can talk if you want." Keanu's eyes met his for the first time since he walked in. For a split second, Harold saw the exhaustion in his face, like the weight of the world had been slowly wearing him down. And then, like a dam breaking, Keanu started to speak. "I've spent my life trying to be something I'm not," Keanu admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "I've been pretending for so long. I thought if I just kept pushing, kept working, kept doing the thing everyone expected of me, I'd be happy. But I'm not. I'm not happy. I don't even know who I am anymore." Harold listened intently, his heart aching for the man in front of him. The actor who had it all, fame, fortune, adoration from millions, was crumbling, at least internally. It was clear now that Keanu's struggles were more than just the demands of a Hollywood career. It was a battle within himself, and it wasn't something that could be fixed with a simple conversation or a nice car repair. "Sometimes," Harold said after a long pause, "we get so caught up in what other people want from us, we forget what we need for ourselves. It's like being trapped inside a shell trying to please everyone but never really feeling free." Keanu let out a small, bitter laugh. "Exactly. I've been living my whole life like that, pretending to be someone I'm not. I've lost touch with who I really am, and it's like I'm suffocating. I can't breathe." Harold stood up, slowly, and moved over to the small kitchenette, pouring 2 cups of coffee, offering one to Keanu. "It's okay to feel that way, it's normal, but the thing is, you've got to face it. You've got to look inside and figure out who you really are, beyond the roles, beyond the fame. Because that's the only way to find peace." Keanu accepted the coffee, but he didn't drink it. Instead, he stared at the cup, deep in thought. "I don't know how," he confessed. "I don't even know where to begin." Harold sat back, down beside him, offering a quiet reassurance. "It's not about having all the answers at once. It's about taking one step at a time. Little by little, you'll figure it out. And the more honest you are with yourself, the closer you'll get." Keanu looked up at Harold, his face filled with gratitude mixed with doubt. "But how do I even start? How do I know if I'm on the right path?" Harold thought for a moment, his gaze shifting to the old car parts that lined the shelves of the shop. "It's like fixing a car, son. You start with what's broken, right? You check the engine, see what's off, and then you work on it piece by piece until it runs smooth again. It's the same with life. You start with the parts that aren't working, your fears, your doubts, your struggles, and you take a good, hard look at them. Then you slowly fix them." Keanu was quiet, still processing the advice, the weight of Harold's words. "I guess I've been trying to avoid the broken parts," Keanu said quietly, his voice full of realization. "I've been so afraid of facing them, of admitting that I'm not perfect. But maybe that's what I need to do. Stop pretending." Harold smiled gently, his tone softening. "It's okay to not be perfect. It's okay to fall apart sometimes. You're human, Keanu, just like the rest of us." Keanu's face softened, and for the first time in days, there was a hint of relief in his eyes. "Thanks, Harold," he whispered. "I didn't know I needed this, but I do." Harold clapped him lightly on the shoulder, an old man's comforting gesture. "Any time, son. You take care of yourself, and remember, you're never alone in this. We all go through tough times." As Keanu stood up to leave, he looked at Harold one last time, a genuine smile now lighting up his face. "I'll remember that," he said, his voice steadier now. "Thanks for being here." Harold watched him walk out of the shop and drive away, a sense of peace settling over him. He hadn't just fixed Keanu's car this time, he'd helped him face something far more difficult. And in a small, quiet corner of a small-town auto repair shop, a bond had been formed, a bond that neither fame nor fortune could break. The following days in the shop felt different for Harold. There was a lightness in the air, a subtle shift that he couldn't quite explain. Keanu had come to him with his struggles, and now it seemed he was walking away with a little more peace, a little more clarity. That's all Harold could ever hope for, a person who walked in broken, leaving just a bit more whole. Harold's routine returned to normal after Keanu's visit, but the memory of that conversation lingered. And yet Harold couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their story. Something told him that Keanu had more to work through, and maybe, just maybe, Harold would play a part in it. A week passed without any sign of Keanu. Harold went back to his usual routine, tinkering with cars, chatting with the locals, and enjoying the peaceful rhythms of small-town life. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough. Harold didn't need the lights of Hollywood or the applause of a crowd to feel fulfilled. His satisfaction came from the quiet moments, the ones that passed unnoticed by many, but meant everything to those who appreciated them. But on a warm Thursday morning, as Harold was sorting through some old car manuals, he heard the familiar hum of the black car pull into the lot. His heart skipped a beat as he looked up. This time there was no hesitation in Keanu's stride. He walked with purpose, his face set in determination. "Morning, Harold," Keanu said, his voice different this time, stronger, more grounded. "Morning, son. What's on your mind today?" Harold asked, wiping his hands on a rag and leaning against the counter. Keanu paused, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, but there was a quiet confidence in the way he stood. "I think I've figured out what I need to do next." Harold raised an eyebrow. "Yeah? What's that?" Keanu's gaze softened, and he walked over to the workbench where Harold had just set down a pair of car keys. "You were right about everything. It wasn't about fixing what was broken in my career or my life. It was about fixing myself. And I realized, I've been running from myself for so long I never stopped to see who I really am." He looked up at Harold then. The weight that had been on his shoulders seemed lighter. "I've spent my life trying to make everyone happy, trying to be the perfect actor, the perfect person. But that's not me. I've been chasing something that doesn't exist." Harold nodded, not surprised by Keanu's words. "You can only run so long before you run out of road, son. But the good news is you found yourself on the other side of that road. That's what matters." Keanu smiled, a genuine, free smile that stretched across his face. "I finally made the decision to take control of my life. I'm stepping back from some of the noise. I'm taking time for myself. I've realized that who I am off-screen matters just as much as who I am on it." "Good for you," Harold said, his voice full of warmth. "You'll never regret giving yourself the time to just breathe." Keanu nodded, looking thoughtful. "I've been thinking about something else too. Something you said the other day, about starting with the broken parts. I realized that it's not just about fixing myself. It's about healing those parts, accepting them, and moving forward." Harold smiled, feeling a sense of pride. "You're right. Healing takes time, but it's the only way to grow." Keanu paused, and then looked at Harold, his eyes sincere. "I'm not just here to talk today. I wanted to thank you. For listening. For being there when I didn't have anywhere else to turn." Harold raised his hand in a gesture of humility. "I didn't do anything. You were the one who faced your demons, son. I just helped point you in the right direction." Keanu shook his head, his expression grateful. "You did more than that. You gave me a sense of clarity, something I hadn't realized I needed. I'm learning that it's okay to step back, to let go of expectations, and to embrace who I really am." Harold chuckled softly. Well, it looks like you're on your way to figuring it out. It's never easy, but it's worth it. Keanu looked at him for a moment, then added with a chuckle of his own, "You know, I always thought I had everything figured out, but talking to you made me realize how much I've missed in my own life. Things that truly matter." Harold shrugged, smiling. "You're not the first person to think they had life figured out. We all get there eventually, sometimes a little later than we'd like." Keanu stepped toward the door but then stopped and turned to Harold once more. "I'm going to take a few weeks off. I'm going to spend time with the people who matter most. Focus on things that make me feel whole again. No cameras, no distractions, just me, just real life." Harold's smile widened. "That sounds like the right move, son. You deserve it." Keanu opened the door and turned back to face Harold. "You'll always have a friend in me, Harold. I'll never forget what you've done for me." With that, Keanu walked out of the shop, the hum of the black car slowly fading as it disappeared down the road. Harold watched him go, a contented smile on his face. Maybe it wasn't his place to give advice. Maybe he wasn't the one with all the answers. But in that moment, Harold knew that he had helped someone who had everything but still needed a little help finding themselves, and maybe that was the most important thing of all. 2 weeks had passed since Keanu had left. The shop and life had settled into its usual rhythm. The shop was as busy as ever, though the memory of Keanu's visit lingered in the back of Harold's mind. The idea that someone so famous, someone with everything the world seemed to desire, could be so lost, so vulnerable, had struck Harold more deeply than he realized. Harold didn't hear from Keanu during those 2 weeks, but a part of him understood. It wasn't about the fame or the cars or the spotlight. It was about healing, about stepping away from the chaos long enough to listen to the quiet whispers of his own heart. But then, one evening, when Harold was just about to close the shop, the familiar black car pulled into the parking lot once again. This time, however, it wasn't just Keanu. A sleek black SUV followed close behind, and Harold's curiosity spiked. Keanu stepped out of the car, his face unreadable. But behind him, there was another figure, a man in a well-tailored suit, carrying an air of authority that contrasted sharply with the quiet demeanor Keanu had shown in their previous encounters. The man was tall, his dark hair neatly combed, and he looked like someone who belonged to a world far removed from the dusty, quiet life of the mechanic's shop. Keanu gave Harold a small, tight smile as he approached. But there was something about him now, a heaviness in his eyes, a layer of tension in the way he held himself, that was different from before. "Evening, Harold," Keanu greeted, though his voice wasn't as light as it had been during their previous conversations. "Evening, son, what's going on?" Harold asked, noting the change in Keanu's posture. Keanu glanced over his shoulder at the man standing by the car. "This is Nathaniel," he said, his voice faltering slightly. He's with my team. We've been going over some things and, well, there's something I need to share with you. Something I should have told you earlier." Harold raised an eyebrow but nodded in acknowledgement to Nathaniel. "Nice to meet you. What's all this about, Keanu?" Keanu hesitated, the words not coming as easily as they once had. He turned back to Nathaniel, his eyes filled with a quiet pleading. The man gave him a nod, a silent understanding passing between them, before Keanu turned back to Harold, as if steeling himself for something difficult. "I didn't just come here to talk about my life or my career, Harold," Keanu began, his voice much quieter now. "I've been running from something big. And it wasn't just the pressure of the public life, it was something I'd been hiding for a long time." Harold's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, son? What's going on?" Keanu swallowed hard, his face tense. "I've been hiding the truth. Not just from the public, but from myself, and now it's caught up with me." The weight of Keanu's words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Harold didn't interrupt, knowing that this wasn't the time to speak, that Keanu was about to share something personal, something that he had been holding inside for far too long. "There's something I've been ashamed of," Keanu continued, his eyes casting downward. "I've been afraid of being honest, of letting people know the truth about who I really am. But I can't hide anymore. Not from you, not from the world." Harold could feel the tension building, and he noticed how the light outside the shop seemed to grow dimmer, as if even the world itself was holding its breath. Keanu paused for a long moment, the silence between them deafening. Then, with a deep breath, he let it all spill out. "I've been battling addiction," Keanu admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just for a few weeks or months, but for years. It's something I've kept hidden from everyone. The press, my fans, even my closest friends. And I've been pretending like it's not there, like I have it all under control. But I don't." The words hit Harold like a thunderclap. He hadn't seen it coming. Harold had suspected that Keanu's struggles were deeper than what he had shared. But addiction, that was something else entirely. Keanu continued, his voice quivering with vulnerability. "I've been in denial about it. I thought if I just worked harder, kept pushing forward, I could bury it. But it's been eating away at me. I'm not proud of it, but I can't keep hiding it anymore. It's ruining everything. And I've finally decided to face it." Nathaniel stepped forward, his presence solid and calm. "Keanu's decided to seek treatment," he said, his voice firm but compassionate. "We're working with specialists to get him the help he needs. This is the first step." Harold felt a surge of emotions, shock, concern, even a little anger at the world that had allowed someone like Keanu to slip so far into the darkness. But the most overwhelming feeling was compassion. Here was a man, so used to being strong for others, so used to hiding behind a facade of perfection, finally letting himself be seen for who he truly was. Harold's voice was low, but filled with warmth. "Son, no one's perfect. We all have our demons. The important thing is that you're facing them now, and you don't have to do it alone. You've got people who care." Keanu looked at Harold, his eyes filled with gratitude and a little relief, as if he had expected judgment, but found only understanding. "Thank you," Keanu whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. Harold smiled softly. "Take it one day at a time, son. You don't have to fix it all at once. Just focus on taking the next step and the next and the next." For the first time in what felt like forever, Keanu looked truly vulnerable, but also free. Free from the burden of hiding, free from the constant pressure of being someone he wasn't. It was the beginning of something big, something that would change the course of his life. Harold clapped him gently on the shoulder. "I'll be here whenever you need me. Just remember you're not alone in this." As Keanu and Nathaniel left the shop, Harold watched them go, his heart heavy but hopeful. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs in life didn't come from the world's applause. They came from the quiet moments, the decisions made in the darkest times, and the strength to face what had been hidden for so long. Weeks passed, and the sound of Keanu's black car was a distant memory for Harold. Life in the shop continued as usual. It had always been simple, fixing cars, listening to stories from the townsfolk, and offering a little advice when asked. But something about the visit, the rawness of the moment when Keanu had shared his struggle, lingered with Harold. It had stirred something deep within him, a reminder of his own past, of times when he too had to face parts of himself he wasn't proud of. But Keanu's story was not just about addiction. It was about courage. It was about taking the time to face the truth, no matter how hard or uncomfortable it might be. Harold had seen it firsthand, the moment when a person decided to stop running, to stop hiding from themselves. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And it gave Harold hope that no matter how dark life seemed, there was always a way out. It was an ordinary Tuesday when Keanu returned. This time it wasn't just him alone. The black car was there, parked just outside the shop, but Keanu wasn't walking towards the door. Instead, he was standing next to a woman Harold didn't recognize but who held an air of quiet confidence, her eyes calm but observant. She smiled warmly at Harold as he stepped outside. "Hello," she greeted. "My name's Sarah. I'm part of Keanu's support team." Keanu gave Harold a small nod. There was something different about him now. His shoulders weren't as tense, and his eyes had a softness to them that Harold hadn't seen before. Harold smiled back, his gaze flicking between Keanu and Sarah. "Good to see you, Keanu. Sarah, it's nice to meet you." He gestured for them to come inside. "You two have time for a cup of coffee?" Keanu's smile was genuine. "I'd love that. It's been a while." As they sat down at the workbench, Harold poured coffee into mugs, the warm steam rising. between them. It wasn't until they were all seated that Keanu spoke again. "I just wanted to check in," Keanu said, his voice steady now, not burdened by the weight of secrecy. "I've been going through treatment, and it's been harder than I thought, but Sarah's been helping me every step of the way." Sarah nodded, her expression reassuring. "Keanu's been incredibly brave. It's not an easy path, but he's committed to his healing, and that's the first step." Harold leaned back in his chair, looking at Keanu with a quiet understanding. "Healing takes time, son, but it's worth it. You'll find your way, one step at a time." Keanu glanced out the window, his eyes distant for a moment before returning to Harold. "You were right, Harold. You know, when I first came here, I was broken, pretending to be someone I wasn't. I've spent most of my life running from things I didn't want to face. But now, I realize that it's okay to stop and look at the mess I've made." Sarah gave him a small smile. "It's a process, but you're doing the work, and that's what matters." Keanu looked back at Harold. "I came here to thank you again, for everything, for giving me the space to be real, even when I didn't know how to be." Harold chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Son, you don't need to thank me. I didn't do anything. You did the hard part. You faced your truth." Keanu nodded slowly. "Yeah, but I couldn't have done it without people like you. I don't know where I'd be without this place, without you, Harold. You helped me when I needed it the most, and I'll never forget that." The words hung in the air, and Harold could feel the weight of them. It wasn't often that someone took the time to acknowledge the small acts of kindness that sometimes went unnoticed. But Keanu wasn't just thanking him for advice or the use of his shop. He was thanking Harold for being present, for offering a quiet space to reflect, a space that had allowed Keanu to face the truth. "I don't need much," Harold replied, his voice steady. "But I do believe in the power of people helping each other, especially when they need it the most. You'll make it through, Keanu, and when you're on the other side, you'll be stronger for it." Keanu's eyes glistened with emotion, but he held back the tears. "I don't know how I would have made it this far without your help, without your honesty. You showed me that I don't need to have it all figured out, that it's okay to be imperfect." Harold smiled, his heart full. "That's the thing, son. None of us have it all figured out. But if we keep moving forward, even when it feels impossible, we find the way." Sarah looked at Keanu, her expression proud. "You've already made so much progress. Just remember, healing isn't a destination, it's a journey." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "I'm starting to understand that. And it's not just about fixing the past, it's about moving forward. It's about building something new." Harold could see it in Keanu's face. The journey wasn't over. But for the first time, Keanu wasn't running anymore. He was walking at his own pace, taking the necessary steps to create a future that wasn't defined by past mistakes. And that was enough. "Take it one day at a time," Harold said, his voice full of wisdom, "but you're on the right path." The three of them sat in the quiet of the shop, sipping coffee and talking about small things, life, the weather, and even the cars they were working on. There was no rush, no expectation, just people connecting in the way that mattered most. As Keanu and Sarah prepared to leave, Keanu turned back to Harold, his face soft and sincere. "Thank you, Harold," Keanu said again, "for everything." Harold smiled and nodded. "Anytime. Son, you know where to find me." With that, Keanu and Sarah walked out into the afternoon light, their footsteps light and purposeful. Harold watched them go, feeling a deep sense of peace settle in his chest. The world was a mess, yes, but sometimes, just sometimes, two people could meet by chance and help each other find their way out of the darkness. And that was enough to keep the world turning. It had been several months since Keanu's visit, and things had returned to a quieter pace in Harold's world. The days were full of routine, the hum of engines, the clink of tools, and the steady stream of customers coming and going. There were the usual cars, the small repairs, and the conversations that always seemed to revolve around the same things: football, the weather, and the occasional gossip about the town's residents. Life was good, simple, and comfortable, but something in Harold had shifted. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he felt that his world had expanded in ways he hadn't expected. One crisp autumn afternoon, when the air was cool but The sun still offered a gentle warmth. A car rolled into the lot. It was sleek, silver, and unmistakable. Harold recognized it immediately. Keanu's black car was back. But this time, there was something different in the air. It wasn't the usual humdrum of a customer coming for a quick tune-up. Harold felt a surge of excitement and, frankly, a little nervousness. He wiped his hands on a rag, setting his tools down, and walked outside to greet Keanu, who was standing beside the car, looking as calm and composed as ever. But this time, he wasn't alone. A young woman was with him, someone Harold hadn't seen before. She was dressed in a simple but elegant outfit, with dark hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. She looked familiar, but Harold couldn't quite place her. Her confident posture and the way she carried herself suggested she was someone who wasn't, easily intimidated by the world of mechanics and grease. Keanu greeted Harold with a warm smile. "Hey, Harold, I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, son. You're always welcome here. What brings you back?" Harold asked, trying to hide the curiosity bubbling inside him. Keanu's eyes shifted to the woman beside him, and he smiled. "This is Lily," he said, his voice softer than usual. "She's part of my team. I thought I'd bring her by to show her the place that helped me when I needed it most." Lily offered Harold a friendly smile, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Nice to meet you, Harold. Keanu's told me a lot about you." Harold raised an eyebrow, unsure of what exactly Keanu had shared. "Nice to meet you too. Hope he's been saying good things about me." Lily laughed lightly. "All good things, I promise." Keanu chuckled, his smile genuine, though there was an unmistakable weight in his eyes, a quiet strength that spoke volumes. "I wanted to show Lily how this place helped me find a new direction. I think she'd appreciate it." Harold nodded, feeling the depth of the words. There was something significant about this moment. Keanu wasn't just here for another repair or a quick fix. He had brought someone into his world, someone who had been part of his healing process, and that to Harold felt like a full-circle moment. "Well, I'm glad you're both here," Harold said, his voice warm with sincerity. "Take a seat. We've got plenty of coffee inside. Tell me what's been going on." As they made their way to the small break room at the back of the shop, Keanu and Lily sat across from Harold at the table. The conversation flowed easily at first, light-hearted, casual. Keanu talked about the new projects he had been working on, the films he was involved in, and the changes that had come with his newfound focus on healing. Lily listened attentively, her presence calm and grounded, adding her own thoughts occasionally, but mostly just supporting Keanu with a look or a soft smile. But as the afternoon sun began to dip, Keanu's tone shifted. There was an intensity in his words now, a quiet conviction that made Harold pause. "You know, Harold," Keanu said, his eyes meeting Harold's, "I've been thinking a lot lately about how I got here, how I got to this point in my life. There was a time when I thought I had everything figured out, but the truth is I didn't. I was lost and I didn't know how to find my way back." Harold nodded, understanding all too well. "Life has a way of throwing curveballs when we least expect it, but you made it through, Keanu. You're still here." Keanu's gaze softened. "Yeah, I'm here. But not because I did it alone. I had help along the way. People like you, Harold. You were one of the first people to show me that it's okay to admit when you need help. And it's okay to take a step back, even if it feels like you're losing everything." Lily reached out, placing a hand gently on Keanu's arm. "And I think that's the beauty of it, isn't it? Realizing that you don't have to have it all figured out, that you're allowed to just be. No pretenses, no walls." Harold looked at them both, sensing the depth of their connection. Keanu wasn't just talking about recovery anymore. He was talking about a new way of living, a new way of being. And Lily, standing by his side, wasn't just a bystander in this process. She was part of the journey, a partner in this new chapter. "I'm glad to see you both so at peace," Harold said, his voice filled with warmth. "I've always said that life's a journey, and sometimes we need people to help us along the way. Seems like you've found a good one." Keanu smiled at Harold, his face open and genuine. "I have, Harold, and I think the most important thing I've learned is that it's okay to let go of the idea that everything has to be perfect. Life is messy, and we're all a little broken. but that doesn't mean we can't keep going. Lily's eyes met Harold's, her expression thoughtful. And it's about being open to change, no matter how hard it is. Harold couldn't help but feel a sense of pride swell inside him. Here in his shop, surrounded by grease, wrenches, and the smell of motor oil, he had witnessed something incredible. Keanu was no longer just the actor who had walked into his shop months ago, lost and running from himself. He was someone who had faced his truth, embraced it, and was now using his experience to help others. The conversation drifted into other topics, but Harold couldn't help but feel that this moment was significant. Keanu, the man who had once seemed unreachable, was now grounded, at peace with who he was. And the journey wasn't over. But it had changed. And in that change, Harold saw the potential for something truly beautiful. As the evening wore on and the last of the sunlight disappeared, Keanu stood shaking Harold's hand with a genuine appreciation. "I'll see you around, Harold, and thanks again." Harold smiled, watching them leave the shop, the warmth of the moment lingering long after the car had driven off. Weeks passed since Keanu's visit, and Harold's life settled into its usual rhythm once again. The mornings were quiet, save for the occasional hum of an engine or the soft rattle of tools being used to tighten bolts and fix parts. There were no more surprise visits from Keanu, but the memory of their conversations lingered in Harold's mind. He found himself reflecting often on the things they had shared, particularly the way Keanu had spoken about letting go of perfection, embracing the messy parts of life, and finding peace within himself. Harold couldn't deny that something had shifted in him too. The wisdom that had passed between them wasn't just about helping others, it was about recognizing the power of vulnerability and human connection. He had spent his life working on cars, fixing mechanical issues, and offering small pieces of advice to people who needed it. But that visit from Keanu had reminded him of something more, of how the heart, just like an engine, needed care and maintenance too. On a cool morning in late October, Harold was outside, leaning against the hood of a car he was working on, when he saw a familiar figure walking toward him. It wasn't Keanu this time, but Lily, the woman who had accompanied him during their last visit. She was carrying a large envelope in her hands, and her face carried the same calm, measured expression that Harold had come to recognize. She smiled when she saw him and waved, the kind of wave that suggested something important was about to happen. "Morning, Harold," Lily said as she approached, her voice calm but with an undertone of excitement. "Well, well," Harold chuckled, wiping his hands on a rag. "Didn't expect to see you here. What brings you by?" Lily's eyes sparkled, and for a brief moment she seemed to hesitate, as if trying to figure out how best to word what she had in mind. She handed him the envelope. "Keanu and I have been working on something, and we wanted to share it with you. It's a little thank you for everything." Harold took the envelope, feeling a small flutter of curiosity in his chest. He could see that Lily was genuinely excited, and his curiosity got the best of him as he opened it. Inside there was a folded piece of paper and a small glossy card. The paper contained a note written in Keanu's familiar handwriting. "Harold, you were there for me when I needed it most, and I won't forget that. You reminded me that sometimes the smallest gestures make the biggest difference. You've been a guide for me in more ways than you know. This is just a small token of my appreciation for the wisdom you shared and the time you gave me. With gratitude, Keanu." Harold smiled softly as he read the words, feeling a lump form in his throat. It wasn't the kind of thanks he'd expected, but it was exactly what he needed to hear. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness, the quiet moments of presence, were the things that really made an impact. He looked up at Lily, who was watching him with an almost expectant expression. "Thank you, Lily. This means more than you know. You tell Keanu for me he's one of the good ones." Lily nodded. "I will, Harold. And there's something else, too." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. It looked old, well-worn, but there was something about it that spoke of history, of stories lived and remembered. "Keanu wanted to make sure you had this," Lily said, her voice soft. "He thought you might find it useful." Harold took the journal from her hands, turning it over in his palms. The leather felt smooth, almost comforting. He opened it to the first page, where a single sentence was written in bold, elegant script. "Every journey begins with a single step." Harold's heart swelled as he read the words, the simplicity of the message hitting him harder than he expected. It wasn't just a journal. It was a reminder that every journey, no matter how long or difficult, had to start somewhere. And for Keanu, that journey had begun in a mechanic's shop in a small town. "Well, I'll certainly put this to good use," Harold said, his voice quiet with gratitude. "I don't know what to say, Lily. You've both done more for me than you'll ever know." Lily smiled, her eyes warm. "It's not about what we give, Harold. It's about what we take with us along the way. You've taught Keanu a lot, and that's more than any of us could have asked for." As she turned to leave, Harold couldn't help but feel a shift within himself. He wasn't just the quiet, solitary mechanic anymore. He was part of something bigger, part of a chain of people helping one another, each person offering their wisdom, their kindness, and their presence in ways that mattered. It wasn't just about fixing things. It was about the people, the connections, and the lessons that stayed long after the work was done. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the shop. Harold looked at the journal in his hands, feeling the weight of its message. It wasn't just a gift. It was a challenge to keep moving forward, to keep learning, and to continue being a part of the stories that unfolded around him. As he sat back down at the workbench and started cleaning his tools, Harold felt a sense of peace settle over him. Life wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful in its imperfections, and the journey, no matter how long, had only just begun. It had been a few months since Lily and Keanu had visited Harold, but life in the small town had remained much the same. The daily hum of the garage, the steady rhythm of the world around him, kept Harold grounded. And yet something within him had subtly shifted. Every customer, every conversation, even every engine he repaired, now felt more meaningful. He had learned the true value of human connection, of how the simplest acts of kindness could make the biggest impact. But there was still a piece of unfinished business, something lingering in the air that Harold couldn't shake off. Despite all the change and the gifts Keanu and Lily had brought into his life, Harold couldn't help but feel like there was one more chapter yet to be written in this story, something he hadn't expected. One morning, as the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, Harold was knee-deep in a particularly tricky engine repair when he heard the familiar sound of a car pulling into the lot. He looked up and couldn't believe his eyes. Keanu's black car was parked right outside the shop again, and this time, Keanu himself stepped out, alone. He was dressed casually, wearing his usual understated look, jeans, a simple jacket, and that calm expression that Harold had come to recognize. There was no camera crew, no entourage, just Keanu as a person, someone who had become a friend over the course of the last few months. Harold stood up, wiping his hands on his rag, a mix of surprise and curiosity washing over him. "Keanu," he called, a wide grin spreading across his face. Keanu smiled warmly and walked over, extending a hand for a handshake. "Hey, Harold, I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, son," Harold replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Always a pleasure to see you. What brings you back?" Keanu's expression softened, his eyes serious but kind. "I've been thinking a lot lately, Harold, about everything that's happened, the repairs, the conversations, the things you've taught me. And I realized something important. I've learned a lot, but there's still more for me to understand, more for me to experience." Harold raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You've been on quite the journey, haven't you?" Keanu nodded, his voice quieter now, as if he were choosing his words carefully. "I have. But it's not just about where I'm going, it's about who I'm becoming along the way, and I think that's what you've shown me." Harold felt a swell of pride, but he kept his tone casual, trying not to let the emotion overwhelm him. "Well, I've just been doing what I know best, fixing things. Sometimes the people need more fixing than the cars do, I suppose." Keanu laughed softly. "You're right, and that's why I wanted to come here today, because I need your help with something. It's not about a car this time, Harold. It's about something more." The quiet weight of his words hung in the air. Harold's curiosity piqued. He leaned in slightly, sensing the gravity of the moment. "What's on your mind?" Keanu paused for a moment, taking a breath before continuing. I've decided to take a break from acting. I need some time away to just be, to learn more about myself and, well, to take better care of the things that matter. I've spent so much of my life in the spotlight, living for others' expectations. But it's time for me to step back and focus on what's truly important. Harold nodded slowly, understanding exactly where Keanu was coming from. I get it, son. Life's a funny thing, isn't it? Sometimes you don't even realize how much of yourself you've given away until you take a step back. Keanu smiled, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes that Harold had never seen before. Exactly. And I know this might sound strange, but part of that journey includes you, Harold. The things you taught me, the way you showed up for me, when I needed it most. That's what made me realize that there's a lot more to life than what I've been chasing. Harold was silent for a moment, processing what Keanu had said. The humility in his voice, the openness, Keanu had truly come a long way. And now he was looking at Harold, not just as a mechanic, but as someone who had played a role in his transformation. "You've got a lot of heart, Keanu," Harold said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm proud of you. It takes a lot of guts to make a change like that. But remember, sometimes it's the small, quiet moments that make the biggest difference in the long run." Keanu nodded, a gentle smile forming on his face. "I'll remember that, and you've already made a difference in my life. I just wanted to come back and say thank you, again." There was a long pause between them, two men standing on the edge of a new chapter in their lives. The shop around them hummed with the quiet sounds of work, tools clanking, the rhythm of progress. But in that moment there was a profound stillness between them, a shared understanding of what had been and what was yet to come. "You're always welcome here, Keanu," Harold said, clapping him gently on the shoulder. "Come, back any time, and when you're ready, we'll have that coffee we've been talking about." Keanu chuckled, his eyes lighting up with genuine warmth. "Deal, and I'll bring Lily next time. I think you two would get along really well." Harold smiled. "I look forward to it." As Keanu got back into his car and drove off into the distance, Harold stood for a moment, watching him go. He felt a quiet peace settle over him, knowing that their paths had crossed for a reason. In his small mechanic's shop, he had witnessed something truly remarkable. Someone finding their way back to themselves through vulnerability, connection, and an open heart. The road ahead wasn't always easy, but Harold knew that Keanu, just like him, had learned that sometimes the hardest part wasn't fixing what was broken. It was learning to be okay with the cracks and finding strength in the journey. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from.